Hi everyone, and welcome to a new episode of documenting my new studio album, Overwhelming World, where I'll be reviewing some of the songs from this new production for you, my English speaking subscribers. Don't worry, each episode will be updated down to the last detail when it comes to mixing and mastering. Without much more to add, let's get started. So, let's begin by talking about drums. There were a lot of changes here since stage 1. I had mentioned that I was using BFD 3.5, but in the end I said I'm going to redo all the drums from scratch. So I went for it and only used Modern Massive 2 along with some other drum samples. For processing, this time I decided to put more reasoning and logic into my decisions, because before I felt like I was just mixing based on feeling. Now I do it with both feeling and a bit of brain power. So, what did I do in the end? I think for all the drums, kick, snare, and toms, I used a gate to cut a bit of sustain. I never liked excessive sustain, so I tweaked the gate until it sounds the way I like, while also making sure it works for general listening. Then I applied EQ and VCA compression, except on the snare, where I like to use a distressor emulation. It's kind of contradictory because using a distressor on a snare adds more sustain, so I had to set the release slower to keep everything in order. For the kick, I used dynamic EQ to tame the machine gun effect. You know, when you have too many kicks in quick succession. Another important thing was that I EQ'd the kick to round out the low-end spectrum as much as possible before compression, so the compression acted on the entire low end rather than just a small portion. After that, I slightly boosted the low-end transients while reducing sustain. I don't want the bass frequencies rumbling in my ears. On the other hand, I added sustain to other frequency ranges since they felt too short. For the toms, I just applied a gate, EQ, and VCA compression to each one, enough to make them sound good. I also don't like toms with too much sustain, especially in the low end, though cutting too much can make the mix lose a bit of punch. Some people take the time to adjust sustain per song, but imagine doing that across 40 tracks. Even though no one is rushing me, since it's my own music, I'm not sure I'll be that meticulous. For parallel compression, I made sure the FET compression sounded right. I had added some saturation before, but it was muddy in the mix, so I cut most of it and it started sounding better. I always roll back the attack with a transient shaper on FET compression so it doesn't stack with the VCA compression. I also decided to add a distressor here, but lower its gain so I wouldn't have to readjust the other compressors. I added reverb that only works on the overheads, snare, and toms. I could have added the room mic channel, but I was too lazy for that. If you want to try this yourself, you could add it, but remember to lower the input gain for both the overheads and room mic in the reverb channel so they sit subtly in the reverb. I want them audible, but still keeping the snare and toms in focus. I never put reverb on the kick, it just sounds bad. Finally, for the snare and kick samples, I made some tweaks with a transient shaper. I can't list every single one, but I basically played around until they sounded balanced. For the snare sample, I also added a plugin I hadn't used in a long time, the Kilohertz Faturator. I remember the producer of Five Finger the Punch loved using this plugin. I think it gives a certain stereo factor and some saturation to help the snare stand out, but it's tricky to use. If you turn any knob too far, it's instantly too much. That's pretty much all I have to say about the drums. For the bass, I ended up splitting the audio into 2 channels. I didn't want the low end to get bloated with distortion, so I kept the low end clean and only applied distortion to the high frequencies. First, I compressed with an optical compressor, then a FET compressor. I wanted to smooth out the bass transients but not remove them completely, otherwise the mix loses punch. I'm not sure if I EQ'd and compressed it perfectly, since bass has always been tricky for me. But I knew I wanted some transits to cut through while still letting the bass fill out the mix. Thinking about it now, the compression feels fine. Maybe I could boost the FET attack a bit, but it's okay as is. EQing the bass took a bit of work. I used dynamic EQ in several spots, setting a slow attack and then adjusting the release so it wouldn't clamp down on every peak. I also added a stereo expander especially for bass lane by Tom Projects, and I adjusted the gain, and I think it turned out fine. For the rhythm guitars, and I mean just the rhythm guitar since the other guitars didn't get significant changes, I think I only finished the EQ. I don't remember if I mentioned it before, but I also added a fifth guitar, pitched down a full octave. After all the processing, I wanted a bit of more separation between the guitars, so I applied a left-right EQ pattern to make them sound a bit more stereo. For the master, the most important thing was lowering the saturation on several plugins in my chain. Once I adjusted them, boom, the low end stopped sounding bad. Not much else to say there. Now, for a more debatable part of my mix, so if anyone wants to kindly correct me, feel free. I do all this to experiment and enjoy mixing. This involves two things, and the first is about every DI track I recorded, including the bass. My dilemma was this. I always thought cabinet IRs are missing something, and I never heard anyone mention it like this before. When you mic a cabinet, yes, you mostly hear the speaker you're micing, but no one talks about the other three speakers in a 4x12 cab, just as an example. So, my idea was, for every guitar track, I would add the missing sound of those other speakers. I created 3 extra tracks for each guitar track and added a room reverb to them. I adjusted only the drive signal on each according to the position of the other 3 speakers relative to the main one. The farthest one got the lowest drive signal. The closest one got more, but still less than the main. I also EQ'd each extra speaker with non-linear EQ because I wanted the slight phase shifts you get in a real recording. The farthest speaker got more lows, the closer one got some lows cut. If I wanted to take it further, I could delay those signals to emulate their distance from the mic, which would make the tone even more realistic, according to my theory. These reverbs are never at the same volume as the main guitar track. Depending on position, they're louder or quieter, but overall, all these extra tracks are much lower in volume. For me, it's meant to be subtle. Lastly, in the master, I even out the frequency spectrum before hitting the compressor. After compression, I brought back what I had cut. Why? In my mind, doing this should make the compressor work more evenly across the whole mix. But since certain parts usually stand out more, this can flatten the musicality a bit, so I may tweak the cue to keep it from sounding too flat. This is just something to experiment with. I don't want anyone to take this as an absolute truth. Feel free to check with an expert, and you might even teach me something in the process. Think of this as just a grain of sand. I'm only sharing my production theories with you. To wrap up the video, I'll talk about this song I have here. It's already available on my channel, but with a slightly more basic production and in Spanish. In English, the song is called Blind, and in Spanish, it's Ciego. It's basically about people who don't know how to value their good in their country, who think everything is absolutely bad and believe their country is worse than others, when in fact it's the opposite. Because of that, They decide to destroy their country physically and politically. When I create songs like this, I rarely take another song as a reference. And in this case, I didn't. But I think it sounds like a mix between Nickelback and Metallica. Nickelback's group with Metallica riffs. It's under 3 minutes long, and overall I think it's a really fun track. Well, I think that's the end of the video. I'll leave you with a preview of my mix so you can hear how it sounds. I hope you enjoyed this video and are excited to hear more about this album I'm working on. That's all for now. I'll see you in the next one.